Hey US history students! Today's lecture is on the topic of globalization, and this is drawn from a book that some of you may have even picked up at various points in my classroom by Thomas Friedman called The World is Flat, where he goes through what he sees as the sort of 10 major technological developments that have created the globalized society that we live in today. So a little bit of context before we get started here. At this point, you should have read about our three American presidents of the 1970s and 80s, the rise of what's called the New Right, the kind of conservative ideology in American politics that has really lent itself to the modern Republican Party. And that's some important information so that we can understand how globalization happens. There's sort of three key developments that are going to contribute to the advances in technology that really make globalization possible. The first of those is rising mistrust in government. This absolutely stems from Richard Nixon's resignation from the presidency after the Watergate scandal. But the seeds of this had already kind of been sown, right? Even going back to Lyndon Johnson, maybe even going back to John F. Kennedy in the years of the Cold War. Particularly because of the war in Vietnam, more and more Americans were really starting to question their government in a way that we just weren't seeing in the post-war era up until this point. That mistrust in government has in many ways continued today. That has really shaped the modern Republican Party, or the Republican Party maybe of 2016, of 2020, and that is going to cause people to maybe put their faith in other things instead, right? If you can't trust your government to support your business, to support your ideals, then you're going to maybe look for another source of support. Another kind of ingredient of this larger context are changes in American business. We are seeing some periods of economic uncertainty during the 1970s. The 70s sees a period of high inflation, so prices are going up really dramatically at a time that wages are not. Wages have been pretty stagnant really for about the last 40 years of American history at this point, and that really begins in the 1970s. Historians have often called this stagflation, right, where you have the stagnant wages and the prices that are really going through the roof. We also see a continuing kind of flowering of bureaucracy. This really started it has its roots all the way back in the Second Industrial Revolution, but really flowers in the post-war era as more and more Americans take jobs in the service sector, kind of those middle management type jobs where they're not necessarily physically making something or physically performing a service, but they're working with information instead. And then that has gone hand in hand with declines in American manufacturing. There's this development of something that historians call the Rust Belt during this time period, which were all of the industrial cities of the Northeast and kind of the Ohio River Valley into the Midwest. Think about places like Pittsburgh or Gary, Indiana, if you've ever been down south of the city of Chicago. These were major industrial hubs. This is where people, in some cases, almost everyone in the town worked in a manufacturing plant or a factory, and a lot of people started to transition away from that work. Part of that has to do with other countries innovating better, creating better products in the post-war era, and those products really becoming available to American consumers starting in the 1970s and 80s. But part of it also has to do with people maybe leaving a loud, physically demanding factory job for something more like an office job in the bureaucracy. And then finally, the last ingredient of this is the new right kind of coming to power, right? So you should have read a little bit about this in the previous lesson this week, but this is an ideology that really puts its trust in business. This is all about free market capitalism and the idea that the forces of supply and demand and the invisible hand of the market are really all the regulation that's needed, and that we can trust that business is going to shape the economy appropriately, or more appropriately than government regulation would do. This is a really powerful idea, even for Democratic politicians like Bill Clinton. When he is elected president in the 1990s, we see Democrats saying things like this famous line from Bill Clinton's State of the Union address, I believe, that the era of big government is over, which is a huge shift away from how liberals and members of the Democratic Party had really been thinking about the role of government. Think back to the New Deal, for example, right? A moment where government was very, very active. So all of those shifts are really going to give us the flatteners that we see. There are a lot of questions kind of swirling around globalization, right? If you do any sort of research on this topic, you'll find that the sort of debate around globalization, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing, is a compelling question. However, that is not the question that I'm going to try to answer in today's lecture. I want to talk more about why is this globalized society possible? How did it come about? And then you can make your own judgments about whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing. All right, so here's our first flattener. I'm going to give you a bunch of images and kind of give you a moment to let them sink in, think about what they might mean, and then I will tell you that this image in particular is the fall of the Berlin Wall. So this is a significant event in a couple of different ways. Number one, obviously, it marks the end of the Cold War, right? The Berlin Wall was this wall built through the middle of the city of Berlin in Germany. The east side of the city was communist, the west side of the city was capitalist, and at the time that this wall comes down, it's going to it changes the lives of the people who live there, right? It means that more people in the city of Berlin can participate in new markets, can participate in free trade, but it also has this larger symbolic ending. This is the same time that the Soviet Union is really kind of falling apart, coming to an end. The Soviet Union will be no more by 1991. And so our enemy of the communist empire of the Soviet Union is gone. Not necessarily defeated, right? Because we never actually went to war against them, but it isn't going to exist anymore. And communism as a political and economic ideology is going to look different than it did under the Soviet Union. So the Berlin Wall comes down in 1989, which is a significant year because this is also at the same time where we see the rise of the personal computer. Windows PC and Microsoft Office are introduced the following year. So there's this kind of saying that when the walls came down, the windows went up. And that might seem like a coincidence, but if you also think about the end of communism, meaning that all people can now participate in the global economy, something like a personal computer is going to give people all sorts of new access points to be able to participate in that larger economy than maybe they had before. Here's our second flattener. You guys, this is how the internet used to look. Our second flattener is Netscape, which is still around today. You can still download it as a browser to use on a laptop computer. And Netscape is really significant because it brings the internet to a broader audience. The internet existed. It goes all the way back to the 1980s with something called ARPANET, which was a network of defense and scientific computers and military computers that was basically used by people within the US government and kind of research laboratories. But Netscape is going to make it possible for average everyday people who don't have a security clearance or don't work for the federal government to be able to use the internet. So the computer screen becomes this sort of medium of access for anyone. You don't have to have a certain job, you don't have to have a certain income, you don't have to be a certain age, right? Anyone can now start accessing shared information. Netscape is a publicly traded company. The first shares go on the market at $28 each, and it was later bought by another company called AOL, America Online, which used to send CDs in the mail that you would have to use to get internet access back in the day, back like when I was in high school, and was enormously successful as a business model. So eventually AOL was a $10 billion entity. And you may also be familiar with Netscape because it eventually gives birth to Firefox, right? This idea of kind of an open source, publicly available internet portal really drives Firefox today, and Netscape was its original parent company. Here's our next flattener. Take a moment, look at this graphic, see if you can figure out kind of what's going on here. So our third flattener is workflow software, which does not sound very sexy and exciting, I know. But this is a significant step because it really takes out human beings as the middlemen for a lot of processes that were done in offices. So if you go back and look at this image for a moment, right, instead of a person maybe having to take notes on something and then make copies of that and then file that in a filing cabinet somewhere and then make sure sure that certain information from that gets written in a report and then has to physically print out that report and send it to various people who receive it through the mail. All of a sudden now, a lot of that can be done digitally. You don't necessarily have to have all of the paper trail anymore. And even if you do have the paper trail, more and more of that can be done electronically or can be even automated in some cases. So this is dramatically going to change how offices work and what jobs even exist within offices. And some of the major components of workflow software may already be things that you're familiar with. SMTP stands for Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. That, my friends, is an email server, right? That is going to allow people to actually send messages to each other instantaneously instead of having to write that out, put it in an envelope, get it over to where it used to be. Even in places like schools, right? If you wanted to get a message to one of your peers somewhere else in the building, if you're a teacher or an administrator, and before you had email, you had maybe an inner office system where you had an envelope and that envelope would get sent out to various classrooms, or you would just be printing out various bits of information and putting them in teachers' mailboxes. I get probably hundreds of emails a day. I can't even imagine what that would have looked like if those were all physical messages. Another workflow software development was HTML, which stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and that is one of the easiest or not even internet, but just digital computer coding languages that's going to make it possible for you to use something like email to point people to even more information. You could put a link in that email instead of having to retype something that you found through a special report that was printed out and put on your desk and having to retype it all and then or rewrite it and hand it out to someone. You can just link it to a place online where that information lives. The other development that comes from this particular flattener is that we start to see global platform standards. So instead of people just doing everything in ways that are unique to their business or their country, we start to see almost kind of universal languages, especially programming languages, develop. And that is another important aspect of globalization, that it's not unique to the United States or to Illinois or to Chicago or to Northtown Academy. We use languages that it doesn't matter if you speak English or Mandarin or German or whatever, you can still use some of these universal standards and languages to create these types of software. This is an icon that you may be familiar with, and the next flattener is the idea of uploading. So after you have this connected, information superhighway, it's hard to not kind of fall into cliches, I think, when we talk about the internet, but they're cliched for a reason. When we have this sort of network of information, the next thing that's really going to change how the world interacts with that is the idea that anybody can add to that body of information. Anybody can throw something out there onto the World Wide Web for other people to see. So when we start to see uploading technology, it now means that whole communities can collaborate on shared content. You don't have to necessarily have a special clearance. Again, in the same way that something like Netscape made the internet accessible to everyone, this now means that anyone can also change information that's already out there online. So this is where we see a total flowering of places where people are sharing to that larger wealth of information, right? Blogs emerged during this time. Wikipedia starts during this time. YouTube started when I was in college. I think it was my last year of college. And before that time, there really wasn't a place where people could take a video and share it with their friends. Maybe you could send it through email. We also did not have little recording devices that were this big. If you wanted to take a video of something, you needed like an actual camera. So that made it a little bit harder to find, to share things as well. I had friends in high school who would make movies, and then if we wanted to watch them together, we would have to go to someone's house. We would have to take their little mini cassette, put it in a larger cassette tape, put it in the VCR, and then watch it on someone's television. And that was the only way that you could actually share some of that video technology. But YouTube made it possible for anyone who had digital video to share that video with whoever they wanted to. All sorts of other open source software comes out of this time period as well. Thomas Friedman, the author of this book, has said that this is really the most disruptive force of all, because if you think about who controls the flow of information, uploading means that anyone can control the flow of information, or if not control it, at least add to it or influence it in some way or change what that information is that's going out into the world. And that has incredible effects. Here's our next flattener, a screenshot from a website that makes me go crazy. The next flattener is the idea of outsourcing, right? Just like these students were given an assignment in one of their classes, and instead of doing it themselves, they outsourced it to someone else, which is also called cheating. But in the business world, outsourcing is not necessarily cheating, right? Outsourcing literally just means that you're contracting out a part of your business to another provider. Let's say I am a student in high school, and I have to write a lab report, and I have to write an English a rhetorical analysis essay, and I have to write a DBQ essay. If I was going to contract out one of those services to someone else, I would pay another provider like this, fake essay service to do that for me. So in the school world, that's considered cheating. But if you're a business, let's say you are in the business of making masks for people, right? You might have manufacturing that goes into that. You might have a human resources department that hires the people who come and work in your factory. You might have machinery that needs upkeep and stuff like that. And let's say you don't really have expertise in those areas. You can hire a business to do your HR for you, do your hiring, do your resume reviews as you bring on new staff, maybe even go through things like health insurance or company benefits with new employees to get them kind of onboarded. And I could also contract out to have someone else come and service the parts in my factory, right? If I'm not an expert in that. So we see outsourcing in all sorts of different areas, some of which I've already talked about, right? Consultants. I used to be a consultant before I became a teacher. And consultants really exist as a group of people who you can pay to solve a problem that you cannot otherwise solve. IT is often outsourced, right? There's all sorts of companies that pay a third party to do their computers and their email systems and stuff like that. HR, which I mentioned. Customer service is one that you're probably familiar with. If you are having a problem with a product and you want to get an answer about it, often when you call the helpline, you may get connected to a call center that is nowhere near you, right? Often in another part of the world, but sometimes just like in another part of the country. And you may be talking to someone who is not even a direct representative of that company. So outsourcing is beneficial to companies because it helps them sort of play to their strengths. If I am a mask manufacturer, maybe I have a really good understanding of how to keep respiratory droplets out of people's, from being shared between people, but I might not be great at hiring people, or I might not be great at hooking up emails so that all the different people in my business can communicate with each other. So if you're able to kind of cut out some of those costs, because in the business world, time is money, right? If I have to spend all of my time learning how to do some of those other things, I'm maybe not able to put as much money into the main thing that I'm good at, that I'm actually marketing out there to the rest of the world. It helps narrow focus for companies. Outsourcing has totally contributed to the further rise of the service economy in the United States and in other deindustrializing nations as well. Remember, I said at the beginning of this lecture, one of our kind of pieces of context here is the idea that the world of American business is changing. Outsourcing means that the world of global business is really changing, and jobs that maybe didn't exist, like sitting in a call center and just instead of selling people on the phone, selling some people something on the phone, you're really taking calls and solving problems for people. That was not a job that someone could get maybe 20 or 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago. Which brings us to our next. So if number 5 was outsourcing, number 6 is what's called offshoring, right? It's kind of the next logical step in outsourcing. And it means moving a part of your business to another country. This is often something that's done in manufacturing, right? If you think about iPhones, right? Apple is an American company, but this bad boy was manufactured in China, right? It was made in a factory that was not part of the contiguous United States. So manufacturing, when research, development, design, and et cetera remain local and in-house, like a company like Apple, we see offshoring sometimes with accounting, right? Letting an accounting firm or a bank in another country take care of your money for you. Call centers, which I've already mentioned, right? If I'm having a problem with my bank or with my I'm trying to think of something that would have broken. Oh, I had these bookshelves delivered the other day, and one of them was kind of broken. And so I called overstock.com and definitely spoke to someone in another country, right? This helps companies save money in the same ways that outsourcing does, but almost at a larger scale, right? Often you can pay employees maybe a lower wage if you're hiring them in another country, which for a business can save them some money. Free trade agreements like NAFTA, which is now obsolete. Earlier this year, they finally ratified what's called the MCA2, the Mexico-China-America trade agreement. That makes it possible for us to have trading relationships with those other countries, but it also means that we can maybe, it's easier for American businesses to offshore part of their business to those other countries. Think about American car production today, where many parts in American cars are manufactured in Mexico and then sent back to the United States and then are often sent back to Mexico again. So even making cars, which feels like something that should happen in like just one factory, probably somewhere in Michigan, has become an offshored process. The other interesting thing about offshoring is that it contributes to industrialization in the developing world. At the same time that mature industrial economies like the United States are doing less manufacturing and less industrial work because they're sending some of those jobs elsewhere, it means that countries that maybe didn't have very much of a manufacturing or industrial base are beginning to create those factories and hire people into that work. Whether they're doing that for United States businesses or maybe eventually for local businesses, kind of depends on a lot of different other factors, but it does often inject parts of the developing world with new technology, new practices, new expectations that change the economy in those places as well. This is a very complicated picture. Take a moment, look at it here for a second. And what this picture is trying to represent is the seventh flattener, which is something called supply chaining. If you think about the retail supply chain kind of as a river, it's a river that pulls in a lot of different products, right? Just the kinds of things that you have to create in order to put together something like an iPhone potentially come from all over the world, right? If you've been following anything in the news recently, supply chains have been really in the news a lot as we think about how to produce things like ventilators for COVID-19 patients, or even things like N95 masks, where if part of the world's economy is shut down because people aren't allowed to go to work, it has these sort of ripple effects in other parts of the world, because if I'm a mask manufacturer, I might need that one type of filter that's created in China, or that one type of elastic that's created in Bangladesh. And if I'm not able to get those products, then it kind of slows my business down as well. In better years, thinking outside of 2020 for a moment, supply chaining has been another way that businesses can save costs by using kind of the whole globe as almost kind of like a supermarket for all the different resources that they need, right? Walmart is a really good example of a company that's sort of mastered the supply chain. Products from Walmart are made not just in the United States or in China, but in over 70 countries, or components of them are manufactured in over 70 countries worldwide, which is kind of incredible. They have 11,000 stores, or did a couple years ago when I first put these PowerPoint slides together, and they also have locations in 27 countries. So they've not only taken their supply chain global to get products or resources that they need from all over the world, but they've then also expanded into some of those markets to sell those products back to people. And the net result of that is that they have about $32 billion in inventory. So not in profit, but just in like all the things that exist in their stores. If you were to total up all of the cost of those things, it would be about $32 billion. The main takeaway here is that the fewer links that exist in a supply chain, the cheaper your product becomes, right? Because you kind of can control all of the all of the cost along that supply chain. This is the same exact idea as vertical integration when we talked about people like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller back at the turn of the 20th century, right? Carnegie and Gustavus Swift in Chicago were masters at getting a supply chain that made them as much profit and gave them as much control as possible. So other ideas that are connected to this are limited warehousing, right? Where you're not having product just sit around for a long time. You're making maybe only as much of that product as you need to, which maybe means that you make more at certain times of year and less at other times of year so that you don't have to just have it sitting and paying the cost to store it someplace. And the use of technology to really make this happen as well. RFID chips, like those little kind of infrared, right? That's what the ID stands for. Chips inside of packaging will sometimes tell a company like Walmart exactly how many blow-up swimming pools are going off the shelves over Memorial Day weekend, and then it automatically triggers, okay, we've sold 700 swimming pools, inflatable swimming pools in the city of Chicago. We now need to restock and order 700 more. And it already sort of automatically starts pulling those different parts of the supply chain together, all those different tributaries to get a new set of that particular product to sell. All right. So we talked about outsourcing a moment ago, but flattener number 8 is what's called insourcing. And it is, shockingly, the opposite of outsourcing. It's providing a service that could not otherwise be outsourced, right? So insourcing something helps companies stay competitive in a kind of constantly changing global marketplace. It helps them avoid the hidden costs of outsourcing and offshoring, right? While labor may be cheaper in a country like Malaysia to manufacture something like clothing, there might also be other costs associated with that, whether that's a cost in terms of public relations and kind of the negative attention that often goes along with international garment manufacturing or sweatshops, right? There are all sorts of other costs that sometimes go along with this. Insourcing also can help companies save on taxes, right? You don't have to pay international taxes for some of the labor or the services that you're getting. And it allows for horizontal collaboration between companies. A great example of insourcing is the company UPS, which stands for United Parcel Service, right? And that's what they do. You've seen their trucks double parked outside of your house, blocking up the whole street before, right? Especially right now as people are ordering lots of things online because we can't go out as much. But what UPS has also done in the last couple of years that's made them really successful is they have provided logistics to businesses, right? They are experts at figuring out, thinking kind of about that supply chain. When do products need to be ordered? Where are they going to be warehoused? What is the best path in order to get products to consumers quickly? And they provide that as a service. They have basically become consultants for logistics. Another interesting way that they have used insourcing to kind of continue to compete with other parcel delivery services like FedEx or even the U.S. Postal Service is that UPS now repairs Toshiba computers. Instead of sending them back, they were getting a lot of computers sent from customers through their service to Toshiba, and they realized we can cut out the middleman here, right? Instead of sending these on to a third destination, we'll just keep them in-house. We will train our technicians, UPS employees, on how to do this under Toshiba supervision, and we will provide that service now. So it's kind of a partnership that they've created with that particular company. FedEx has done something similar with Kinko's in the last couple of years, where Kinko's used to exist as a print and copy shop, and FedEx kind of took them over and said, you know, people are creating these things at a Kinko and then sending them out through FedEx. Why don't we just help them do that? And kind of created or took over Kinko's as a way of insourcing that particular product. And anytime you insource, that means a new revenue source for your company, right? You're not just delivering parcels anymore, you're also making money off of people printing letters or graduation flyers or banners or something like that and sending them, or repairing computers. All right, we're almost done. If you're keeping track, there are 10 flatteners, and we are now on number 9. So 9 and 10 are a little bit squishier, right? 9 is the idea of informing. So it's really kind of the idea of what are we using something like the internet for? We have this massive wealth of information now available online, and businesses like Google or its parent company Alphabet have really figured out how do we make all that information searchable? How do we make it usable to people? So this is where we see the development of search engines, right? There was a time, you guys, where the internet existed without a lot of search engines on it. You would have to sort of know the URL that you wanted to go to. If you couldn't remember what it was, there wasn't a central place that you could go to type in that information and have it send you where you wanted to go. So search engines popped up really quickly. Resources like Wikipedia also have grown over time to kind of help organize all of this information that's available online. And that has also helped people transcend previous barriers to information, right? Whether that was geography, being too far away, physically far away from information that maybe was in a special archive or library somewhere. Access, again, that idea of needing to be a certain person or have a certain job or have certain, security clearance or age in order to get information. And also the idea of time. We can transcend time. We can do research so much more quickly now that we have all these different entry points into the information that lives on the World Wide Web. A lot of people have pointed to this as being really a democratization of information and see this as a really good thing, right? That everyone has equal access, both to take information from what's online and also to contribute information to what's online. And then finally, the final flattener are what Thomas Friedman calls the steroids, right? They're flatteners that enhance other flatteners. So in the same way that search engines kind of enhance the internet more broadly, something like wireless internet enhances my ability to give you a video lecture because I no longer have to be tied to one place with a cable coming out of the back of my computer. If I want to, I can walk around my home, which means if I was doing a video about cooking something, I could bring you over here to my kitchen and not have to worry about getting my internet cable stuck inside of my crock pot or something like that. Things like VoIP, which is voice over internet protocol, allows people to make phone calls when they don't perhaps have a phone, right? You can use your computer to make calls, file sharing. And then today, especially, I think about all the personal digital devices that people have, right? Not just cell phones and iPads, but things like smartwatches or Fitbits that connect to that wealth of information that's available online, that upload personal statistics about me and how much I'm walking or not walking, and then allow me to make decisions about my personal health or something like that. So those are the 10 flatteners. I realized that this felt maybe like a little bit less of a history lesson today and maybe more of a sociology or business lecture. But what I'd like you to consider and what I'd like you to answer back in Google Classroom is this question. Thinking about all of this information, all of these flatteners, what does this mean for us? And you can answer that in terms of yourself personally. You can think about us being our class or our school or our community, or you could think about it as the United States more broadly. We're living, as you know, in a very unique moment right now where all of these flatteners, all the ways that the world has kind of become more accessible to people, have made things like distance learning possible or telehealth in ways that we're not experiencing things like education or healthcare before, but they've also created some problems. And there are, I think, some real ways where the flatteners are falling a little bit short, right? These places in our society where we might still have an obstacle that these flatteners are not letting us kind of smoothly pass over at this point. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you guys think about that. So head on back to Google Classroom and answer the questions that are there. Thanks.